Today, more specifically, we will be talking about, hopefully they are fairly visible, these four people: Teofan Bukitov, Dmitry Konstantinov, Georgy Fyodorov, Danil Andreev, are the four authors who will be mostly in the scope of my talk tonight. But before we start talking about the books, let me ask you one question. So when do you think, if you already certainly know the answer, please remain silent. But when do you think the first Russians appeared in North America? Like what century, what half of the century, you say?
Was it during the First Revolution? Was it the Bolsheviks fleeing?
Okay, that would be like 1917.
They came to Alaska and it was...
Sophia, I asked to remain silent. Of course it was Alaska, and it was the 18th century, really. 18th century Russians discovered Alaska and started to try to colonize it, but they were not coming into the main territory of the United States. They were coming to North America from the north, through Siberia, colonizing Alaska, creating the first Orthodox missions in Alaska in the second half of the 18th century. But that aside, Russian immigration to the United States really did not kick in until 1880. But starting from the 1870s and especially 1880s and in the following decades, the number grew sharply. And by the beginning of the 20th century, by the way, way before the 1917 revolution, the number of Russian immigrants immigrating to the United States per decade passed 1.5 million. So in the decade of the 1900s, between 1900 and 1910, as you can see, the number of Russian immigrants in this decade reached the numbers unprecedented before that, more than 1,600,000 people. Surprisingly, despite it is true that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia created what is called the first wave of Russian immigration, this specifically immigration to the United States, the numbers actually dropped in the 1910s, probably for a simple reason of the 1917 Immigration Act, which was a new immigration law introduced in the United States in 1917 that severely restricted or made it much harder to immigrate to the United States, putting restrictions on all sorts of categories of people. It is mostly known for restricting immigration from Asia, but also it introduced restrictions on people with disabilities, people with mental disorders, including epilepsy, people with criminal record, people who was illiterate, people who were politically radical, quote unquote, and was as vague a century ago as it is nowadays. So basically, whole categories of people were excluded from immigration at this point and made the immigration much harder. There were some specific groups like scientists and also clergy that were excluded from these restrictions. So we will see that these people did immigrate to the United States at the time. But this is probably the reason why the United States was not the first choice of Russian immigrants in the immediately after the 1917 revolution and in the 1920s. It was more so that they immigrated to Europe, China, and other destinations. And we will see that actually during the second wave of immigration after World War II, a lot of Russians would actually make it to the United States. So all of these I'm saying for a simple reason, that I want to highlight the fact that the immigration of Russians to the United States did not actually start from 1917, it started before that. In fact, there were entire communities, entire groups of people who immigrated to North America specifically during this time. Who were these people? Well, some of them were members of religious communities persecuted in the Russian Empire. Persecutions for religious reasons did not start from 1917. Already in the Russian Empire, there were certain groups that the imperial government did not like for some reasons. Certain religious minorities like the Old Believers, who were a religious group that emerged in the 17th century in response to a religious reform in the Russian Orthodox Church. The Old Believers were people who did not accept this reform and tried to preserve liturgical texts and practices from pre-reform period. And because the Russian Orthodox Church was so tightly connected with the imperial government did not like this tendency. They saw that it's a form of dissent, basically, and tried to convert actively Old Believers into the Christianity of the Russian Orthodox Church, making the Old Believers to move first to remote regions of the Russian Empire itself, like Siberia, and then later from there abroad to China, Turkey, Latin America, and including to the United States. Although in the beginning of the 20th century, the immigration of Old Believers to the United States specifically was fairly small, it would become much larger in the following decades. Still, some of the first Old Believer communities in the United States emerged well before the 1917 revolution. Another similar group was the Molochans, who were much less known than Old Believers, although in their own right fascinating people. They were sort of, I'm saying this very approximately, they were sort of this reform movement in Orthodox Christianity, who were kind of, on the one hand, similar to Old Believers, in that the Molochans too were mostly farmers, peasants, but at the same time they were kind of similar to the Reformation in that their main idea was to abolish the church, abolish the priesthood, and abolish all of the theological literature and turn straight to the Bible as the only source of knowledge about Christianity and build their beliefs and practices around that. So they didn't have priests, instead they had elders guiding these religious communities. And these guys started to immigrate to the United States very rapidly in the beginning of the 20th century, creating their own communities. For example, in San Francisco, there was a big community of the Molochans that was described in the 1930s by Ilfet Petrov, two famous Soviet novelists who visited the United States, wrote about their experience, and among other things, they described how they met the Molochans there and how they were actually pretty much pro-Bolshevik in San Francisco, because being farmers and blue-collar workers in San Francisco, they kind of sympathized at least with the workers' cause. And they were also, of course, mad at the imperial government for obvious reasons. So some of them actually later repatriated to the Soviet Union fairly successfully after World War II. But that's a different story. So all of this I'm just saying to highlight the fact that the Soviet government was not the first one to make a lot of enemies, but the Soviet government, of course, not only continued but expanded this practice and tried to fight religion very proactively, leading to obvious result. Religious people started to try to leave Russia. So a lot of stories of immigration are stories of people who were in some way or another connected to religion, either being priests or being simply religious thinkers. They did not fit in the Soviet society, naturally trying to leave the country and find better and safer place for themselves. And so here's one of these stories, the story of our first figure for tonight, of Feofan Bukitov. So here is Feofan Bukitov in his youth. It's actually also on display there. His book, it's not really a book, it's more like a journal because it says issue 1. I'm not sure if it ever had issue 2. But yes, here is the portrait, is actually straight from here. It's called The Good Seed, and it was basically a collection of his essays / sermons, which also served to us as an invaluable source of information about the life of an Orthodox Christian parish in New York in the 1930s, because he ended up immigrating to New York in the first wave of Russian immigration. What I find fascinating about this book is the beginning, because in the beginning he tells the story about how he actually got to the United States. And just to provide you some context, he was in 1917. He was basically one of those people who did not accept the Bolshevik revolution and joined the monarchist forces, the so-called White Army. So he was a military chaplain, a military priest, serving with this White Army. And as the Bolsheviks prevailed, these monarchist forces retreated through Ukraine, through Crimea, and he recalls how in the 1919, when they were basically already almost like evacuating the Russian Empire, he got sick, very, very, very sick with typhus, and had a vision. And here is how he describes his visions here on the slide, but I will also read that for you. My soul, he recalls, is fully immersed in contemplating the titanic advance of evil, a sin unfolding before me in a mysterious vision. In front of me is an endless plain, covered in the twilight of the evening fading away. In this darkness, across the entire plain, evil moves forward in straight lines, powerfully and without cease. It is faceless, akin to parts of some huge, soulless machine, and it goes on and on. So he has this vision of basically like the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, as this evil force akin to a mechanism where they are like not even people, but more like robots or something like this, and this wave of these soulless robots with like the same face, basically conquering the Russian Empire. He also says, like, the vision continues, I just did not include it on the slide, but the continuation is that then St. Nicholas appears and tells him, no, everything will be fine, so you don't need to worry that much. And then he has a vision of a Christian like church, of a cathedral. And as he claims, he wrote it in 1933, as he claims it was exactly the same cathedral in New York where he ended up in immigration. And so that's how he says he knew that there was some kind of like divine guidance that led him into becoming a priest of this specific cathedral in New York. So in the 1930s, he served as a priest in one of New York cathedrals, and this is precisely the life of the parish life of which he describes in the book. So, as I have already said, immigrating to the United States at the time was not so easy. So the question is how he managed to do it. Well, I should say he had a good start, actually, because it turned out that he already had served in the United States for 10 years before he returned to Russia in the 1910s, and so before the 1917 revolution. So his story goes like this. He became a priest in the very beginning of the 20th century in 1901. Then almost immediately, he managed to get an appointment as a priest in the United States, together with, by the way, his brother, who also was a priest. So both of them were sent to the United States. And for the next decade or so, he served as a priest in several parishes in the United States and in Canada, leaving an impression in local communities that he was like very active priest, organizing new parishes, being like this missionary throughout the United States. And so when he ended up back in Russia, and when the revolution happened, he managed to return to the United States precisely because he already had a pretty robust network in the United States, including the family and, yes, at least.
If he was already a priest, then there must have been an established community by then.
What?
If he had served as a priest in the U.S. already, there must have been quite a large established
So it was already an Orthodox community.
Yes, and that is precisely why I have shown you this. Yeah. Specifically this. This is precisely the reason why, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Orthodox Church begins to send very actively priests to the United States, because the immigration from the Russian Empire is huge, and there are like the diaspora communities forming in big cities in the United States. So the Russian Orthodox Church feels the need to send priests and to establish Russian Orthodox parishes in the United States. It was precisely a reflection of this, yes, but it's a very good observation. That's what basically empowered him to go to the United States. But even though he had his immigration, on, so to say, on easy settings, as they say nowadays, even then he still says that the life of a Orthodox priest in New York at the time was not an easy one. Definitely was not particularly lucrative profession or anything like this. And at the same time, other members of Russian community in the United States had it even worse. There were, for example, children who lost their parents in the Civil War. There were people struggling financially. And the role of the priest, the way Bukitov thought about it, was that a priest should become like a center of Russian community, preserving like culture and language, not only serving religious purposes, but also creating a sort of like time capsule of the Russian Empire in a way. And actually in the 30s, he sort of laments in his book that by that time, a lot of Russians already did not care that much about preserving pre-revolutionary Russian culture because they started to integrate in American culture, so cared less about religion, or even if they cared about religion, converted from Orthodox Christianity to something else, maybe like became Episcopalian, maybe became something else. Anyhow, so he describes this process of, at the same time, secularization, when people become less and less religious at the time, and a sort of integration of Russian immigrants in American society as they less and less care, and of course he thinks it's a bad tendency, but that's what he describes, as they less and less care about, say, pre-revolutionary tradition, old orthography, Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. So in this sense, it is in itself a very interesting document of the time. Not only it describes the tendencies existing in this era, but also gives us a good idea of the kind of like hopes or aspirations that people like Bukitov had at the time. Because it's really a thought process of a person of the first wave of immigration who still hoped that maybe the Bolshevik government will not last long, so we need to preserve Russian culture, because the moment, say, it collapses, then this culture can be restored. Or even if it does not collapse, the goal is still not to be assimilated and preserve your uniqueness and so on. So this is, I guess, all that I had to say about this person, although, again, I find it's a very fascinating story, as well as a very good source of information about the life of the diaspora in the United States at the time. Now, despite all the difficulties that Bukitov faced, his path to the United States was still relatively straightforward. He had already connections in the United States that he could rely on, and so on and so forth. Not everybody gets to the United States this smoothly. In many cases, the road was much more bumpy. That's the life story of another priest, Dmitry Konstantinov, whose story basically goes like this. He was actually younger generation than Bukitov, as you can see. He was born in 1908. So when the revolution happened, he was 9 years old. So he grew up in the Soviet Union, and he got a good education in the Soviet Union. He got a degree in what we would call library sciences in English, книговедение по-русски. But then 1941 happened, and Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and he was drafted to the Red Army. I should probably add that even before that, in the 1930s, Konstantinov converted, but identified himself as a Christian, but not a Christian of the Russian Orthodox Church, at least the main Russian Orthodox Church, the Christian of what was called the Catacomb Church. The Catacomb Church was not an organization. It was more so a generic name for all forms of Russian Orthodox Christianity that did not want to integrate into the Soviet political system, who did not recognize the Soviet laws.
Say this word catacomb in Russian.
Катакомбная церковь.
Катакомбы,
Да.
подземные, подземелья.
Как первые христиане, которые в катакомбах собирались, когда их преследовали римляне. That was the idea, yes. Sorry. So he was a parishioner in one of these like illegal Orthodox churches, the catacomb churches. And the name catacomb, as I have explained in Russian, is like comes from the practices of early Christians who met in Roman catacombs, like underground places, to hide from Roman authorities. And they call themselves the catacomb church because they were like thinking that they are basically repeating these practices of early Christianity, but not with Rome, but with the Soviet government, but same principle. So he was a member of one of these illegal Christian churches. Then he was drafted in 1941, became an officer in the Red Army, until in 1944 he was captured by the Germans, fighting somewhere, his regime was fighting somewhere in the territory of modern-day Ukraine. So he was captured and ended up in a German captivity, where he decided to join the Russian Liberation Army, which was a pro-Hitler regiments during the World War II, whose idea was basically that they thought that better Hitler than Stalin. Basically, more or less, that was their like thought process. Like they were not necessarily like actively pro-Nazi, but their thought was like, okay, like if that can help to defeat Stalin, then so be it. So he joined one of these Russian Liberation Army forces as a military chaplain, not as a combatant, because it was in Germany that he decided to start a career as a priest. So he was ordained as a deacon first, and then later as a priest, and then he became a military chaplain for this Russian Liberation Army. But then a year later, of course, the defeat of Germany happened, which led him to being in the Allied occupied zone, the west part of Germany, which allowed him to basically never return to the Soviet Union. From there, he moved to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, which was at the time the place, as like one other immigrant reported, accepted anybody, and basically like those who did not have any other place to go basically went to Argentina. So he spent around a decade in Argentina. It was at that time when he started to write actively. And his first works were basically his reflections on his experience of World War II. And one of them was the story of between 1941 and 1944. It's actually called I Fought in the Red Army. And the second one was about his life as a military chaplain in Germany. He started to write essays on social and political topics and so on. He also was accepted as a priest in one of the Orthodox churches in Argentina. Then, a decade later, he was able to move to the United States and spend basically the rest of his life there. It was at the middle of the Cold War era, and ironically, part of the reason why he was able to make a career in the United States was that he became a host of a Christian radio show at Voice of America. So his skills developed as a propaganda priest in the Russian Liberation Army turned out to be super useful when you need to continue to do anti-communist propaganda, because now it is the Cold War. It's an interesting part of this Cold War history that I think people oftentimes underestimate. So this was more or less his story. Now, his books, which were fairly plentiful, can be roughly divided into three main categories. So first were the kind of memoirs, especially around World War II, as I have already said. The second group are the essays and sermons, usually touching all sorts of relevant social, political issues. And the third group, which is his like especially famous for, are the works about the history of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union. These are probably his like the most cited works because he genuinely did a good job collecting all sorts of information about like the number of churches in the Soviet Union in different decades, etc., etc. So I think this is what he's like mostly cited for. So let's quickly take a look at each of these three categories. So first, the books about his World War II experience. I think that the most striking quality of these books is that it's really a very different story of the World War II, written from a perspective from a person who did not share a lot of like narratives that eventually prevailed about the World War II. It is like, in a way, a very unique perspective of a person who by 1941 was already dissatisfied with the Soviet regime and had no good words to spare about it. It's basically forced in the Soviet military during World War II and naturally was very critical about both the Soviet regime and the war itself. That's why, if we take for granted what he wrote in 1952 about that, he recalled how already on June 22nd, 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, his first thoughts, as he recalled a decade later, were, well, could this war finally free those 20 million prisoners from Soviet concentration camps? Could today be the beginning of the restoration of Russia? Which is, again, very different from this mainstream, like, patriotic narrative of the World War II. There were definitely people who thought about it very differently. And then, towards the end of the book, it's the opening, the beginning of the book, the end of it is basically the story, how he was captured, how he and some of his fellow captured soldiers were moved to Germany, and he recalls, he says, the majority of us did not know what the future holds, but what I was sure was that I will not go back as long as this horrible regime governs Russia. So that was the kind of thought process, the kind of position that he kept more or less throughout his future career, especially during the Cold War. Because when we read his essays and sermons from the Cold War period, what we see immediately is that he advocates pretty explicitly for, if not military confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union, like between the West and the socialist camp, but nonetheless, well, to be fair, he does. There is no way around it, because there is an essay which it's actually very interesting. There is an essay which is basically like all around like the Christian attitude to war, and it's like half of the essay is like Christians think that war is bad, killing is not good, except if it's against the Soviets, then it's all right, no problem. I mean, it's like if it's against Soviets, then yes, sure, like go on. And by the way, that was written during the Vietnam War, so like it actually should give you some idea of the background of that, because it was not just like hypothetical thing, it was also a criticism of anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, because he's writing this in the United States during the Vietnam War, with all of these groups in the United States, including some of the religious groups, protesting against Vietnam War. But here is he saying that, no, like the real Christian attitude is that, no, you need to kill the communists. That's really Christian thing to do. So it's really this like very different form of Christianity, I should say. And you could see the origins of it. Again, if you remember his whole life story, you could see how he came up to this view during the 1970s, which, again, I'm not saying that I share it, because I don't, but you could see the evolution of his ideas and how this became a part of the ideology that empowered the United States, paradoxically, during the Cold War. So you could say maybe like Orthodox Christian priests would not have that much role in the United States at the time. But the truth is that some of the biggest supporters of the American policies during the Cold War era were precisely, like the biggest hoax, I would say, were precisely the people who left the Soviet Union because of the fear of, say, religious or political persecutions. Another aspect of his work, as I have already mentioned, is his documentation, organization of information, and collection of information about the life of religious groups in the Soviet Union, especially Orthodox religious groups. And in how he approaches this subject, we can also see the legacy of his origins as a member of this catacomb community, because he describes, so he of course is sympathetic with the struggle of religious people in the Soviet Union trying to preserve their spirituality vis-a-vis an atheistic environment that they had. But at the same time, he's very clear about sort of separating the mass of Orthodox people, the church, from the Moscow Patriarchy. Because he's like, oh, okay, so the real struggle of religious person in the Soviet Union, and he was writing it, by the way, thinking that people in the Soviet Union will read it, because he knew that they will. He had responses in Soviet press, even in Soviet media, to his books. He was fairly noticed in the Soviet Union. Basically, he wrote that the struggle of a religious person in the Soviet Union is a struggle on two fronts. The need to fight against the Soviet government and the Moscow Patriarchate that collaborates with this government. Because, of course, both of them are ultimately the same. But the church in general, both, as he writes here towards the end, both the majority of its ordinary believers who seek actual religion and actual spirituality, and a significant portion of the regular clergy as well as bishops can actually be seen as an allies for himself. Okay, so this is one model of Christianity in the 20th century. I would say it's very conservative, very anti-Soviet, very militant, and very combatant. So it's a right-wing Orthodox Christianity. Not all Christians in immigration were like that. There were very different cases. And one of them, the most interesting, and also presented there in one of the books, this blue book right here in the corner, is Georgy Fedotov. It's interesting because Georgy Fedotov is not particularly well known, and very unjustly so, because he's a very interesting, very original thinker, yet he's not really famous, I would say, not even in Russia, and even less so outside of Russia. His path was very different from our first two cases. I mean, both Bukitov and Konstantinov knew what they wanted. I mean, from the very beginning, they were against the revolution, against the Bolsheviks. Bukitov was an army chaplain in the White Army. Konstantinov was an army chaplain in the Russian Liberation Army. So they fought the Bolsheviks. They knew that for them the revolution was bad, and period. There's nothing more to say about it. But Fedotov actually started his life as a revolutionary, because in the mid-1900s, he was an active member of the Social Democratic Party, LSDRP. He was not like a terrorist or anything like that, but he was an agitator, a propaganda activist who tried to spread social democratic ideas. And he was in trouble with the police because of this. And that's precisely why he spent several years outside of Russia, basically hiding from the Imperial Russian police. He spent some time in Germany and in Italy, and it was precisely in Germany that he developed the interest to medieval studies, to medieval history, which eventually would become his profession as well as his passion. He managed to return to the Russian Empire in the early 1910s, And in 1912, he sort of like was able to solve his problems with the Russian imperial police. He's able to get to a university and to graduate from Petersburg University with a degree in medieval history.
What is medieval?
Medieval. Is it medieval?
Middle Ages.
Middle Age.
Medieval history. And that would be very visible in his future work and in his future ideas. So for the next decade or so, he taught history in several universities in Russia, moving between Petersburg and his hometown of Saratov. Even when the revolution happened, because of his background as a social democrat, activist, pro-revolutionary figure, he did not have that much trouble with the Soviet authorities. But for him, being a Christian and a religious figure, because he always was a Christian all the way, he was like a Christian social democrat. The situation in the Soviet Union became more and more suffocating as the Soviet government consolidated its power. So, in 1925, he decides to leave the Soviet Union. For that, he first basically says, I will go to Germany to do some research, Middle Ages and stuff, and then he never returns. That's more or less how his immigration happened. He moved from Germany to Paris, where there existed a large Russian immigrant diaspora, and became a professor in one of the Russian immigrant universities located in Paris. He taught there until 1940, when France was occupied by the Germans. Then he left France and ended up in the United States. By the time, he was fairly well known as a historian, so he got an appointment at Yale as a visiting professor, after which he spent the rest of his life in New York in St. Vladimir Orthodox Theological Seminary teaching medieval history. So, aside from his works in medieval church history, which is probably of less interest for us now today, he wrote a lot of essays treating social and political subjects. He was very active in this respect, and he represented a very interesting movement within Russian Orthodox thought of the 20th century, which nowadays is all but extinct. Kind of like Christian social liberalism, which tried to combine socialism, liberalism, and Christianity. It's a very interesting, very original movement within Russian Orthodox tradition. In my opinion, it's very sad that it basically is non-existent nowadays. So he had a very interesting analysis of both history, the present, and the future of Western and Russian culture. He basically started with this argument that of all existing civilizations, and he basically went through this civilizational model of history, where the history consists, it's not like a linear process everywhere, but it consists from unique civilizations, each of which goes through its own history, basically. He says, of all his civilizations, only European civilization reached the idea of freedom as an absolute value. And that happened, in Fedotov's view, because of Christianity. Now, how he came to this conclusion is a very interesting intellectual trajectory, but ultimately his argument was more or less like this, that freedom is only possible in a society where nobody has an absolute power over you. So you need to sort of distribute power between different stakeholders. And the first thing that allows you to do that is the separation of church and state, which he thought as a principle that is already evident in Gospels. Specifically in the phrase that Jesus said in Gospels, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Exactly. So, so he thought that this is the core for the separation of church and state. And his argument is more or less like this. In most of civilizations, historically, religious power and secular power are one and the same. Say, Egyptian pharaoh is also a religious figure, a living god, and so on. In Japan, the emperor is also an important religious figure, etc. But in Western civilization, these two roles were separated, say in medieval civilization specifically. These two roles were separated. There were secular leaders, kings, and there was religious authority, and they had to negotiate with each other. So they basically, in his theory, I'm not sure again, are you buying this or not? I need to tell more about this. I think she doesn't buy it. But his theory is more or less, I mean, it's medieval studies actually. So, but his theory was like this. So his argument was more or less like this. So basically, religious authority and secular authority, they kind of keep each other in check. And then there are also other checks and balances. Like, for example, a king has to negotiate with aristocracy, and then all of them have to negotiate with professional guilds, and then all of them has to negotiate with universities that also have their own autonomy, and so on. And because you have these multiple stakeholders, then basically it creates sort of a space of freedom for people to act, navigating between these different powers. Whereas if you break this multi-stakeholder arrangement, then you get a single power that basically is without any checks and balances. And that is what he thinks happened during the French Revolution, for example, or in the Soviet Union, because he thought that once you remove religion from the equation, you lose the strongest power that potentially can oppose to your political leaders. So, his argument again was more or less like this. Say, if you have a certain president who does something that is questionable from moral or human rights perspective, then you can have a pope stepping in and criticizing this policy, for instance. And that will be in the medieval society where religion matters and people take religion very seriously, this kind of judgment would have a lot of weight. So again, you need to negotiate this. But if religion doesn't matter anymore and you only have one vertical line of power with, say, the Communist Party on top of it, then it's the same party that creates the ideology and also has the political power, and basically it's one and the same people. So they don't have to negotiate it with anybody else. That was more or less his argument. Again, there are a lot of things that we can probably criticize in this argument. He himself recognizes, he says, I'm not actually idealizing the Middle Ages. I realize perfectly well that a lot of kings were horrible people, a lot of these aristocrats would want nothing more than torture you or kill you, and then even the church probably wanted to get rid of heretics, and so on. But they kind of, sort of stopped each other from becoming absolutely horrible, which is not something that would happen, say, with Stalin, for example. Again, his point is not that the Middle Ages were great, but more so that they were better than 20th century dictatorships. I mean, it's an interesting argument. Again, there are a lot of obvious weak points there, but at the same time, I have heard on several occasions some modern political scientists making similar arguments with regards to whatever, Iran or something like this, saying that, Iran maybe is better than some other forms of dictatorship, because in Iran, at least, Ayatollah had to negotiate with Quran, which is a text, which you cannot actually go completely crazy, because you at least have this limit that people can, or this other authority of the Quran that people can refer to if they want to argue with you, if they want to oppose you. They can say, but Quran actually says this and that, so maybe we shouldn't do this. So that was more or less the kind of idea that he had in mind. But interestingly enough, even after immigrating from the Soviet Union, he was not exactly anti-socialist. Of course, he was anti-Bolshevik, But at the same time, he understood all too well that the 1917 revolution happened for a reason. There is a reason why he himself was involved into this sort of like social protests. Because like the Russian Empire had its own issues. I mean, there was the issue of anti-Semitism, there was an issue of religious persecutions, and many, many other things. So an issue of inequality. And so he says that if we are to move forward, we actually need to sort of like combine, like Middle Ages and socialism. Not exactly in these words, but basically more or less like this. Because he said, like, for example, like modern democracies have to solve the issue of inequality, learn from socialists, like, I don't know, social security, workers' rights, and so on. But at the same time, we need to learn from like Middle Ages, this kind of like multi-stakeholder approach. And basically his recipe for how to build like a good future after like socialism and after 20th century is more or less like this. First of all, he says we need religion, because it would be like absolute religious norms, they would counterbalance the state power, so we'll have this kind of like balance between secular and religious authorities. Then this should be not just any norms, these norms should be a reflection of what he called religion of individuality and freedom, which he believed exactly what Christianity was. But again, it's like very particular interpretation of it, to be fair. And then he also pointed out another interesting thing, which I believe he was very right about it, is that sovereignty, the idea of like national sovereignty, is a problem. Because if you are like completely sovereign ruler, it means that you can do whatever you want, which is not good for your subjects. So he said, okay, so another problem that we need to deal with is this nation states, which is a product of modernity in their own right. And so it would be good if we could limit them. And that's where the Middle Ages are coming into play. Because he says, okay, so our ideal society of the future, we would limit the nation states by forcing them into some kind of international alliance that would be like an external check on top, but by creating these bottom-up autonomous groups, autonomous collectives, maybe professional societies, and so on, which should be, of course, better than what we had in the Middle Ages, but the idea is more or less the same. Question. If you know anything about the history of Russian philosophy, does it sound at all familiar? Except for, like, Fedotov, forget about Fedotov, but the ideas themselves. The future is Middle Ages, let's create bottom-up associations, etc. Mixed Christianity, freedom, socialism. Okay. Yeah, okay. Does it at all remind of Nikolai Berdiaev? New Middle Ages and so on. That's because they actually knew each other. I'm not quite sure yet who influenced whom. I guess, I wouldn't be surprised if Fedotov actually influeed Berdiaev. They were part of the same circle, really. My trinity. Berdiaev, Fedotov, and that's Lev Grasset, actually, his book is right here. It's another person from kind of the same circle. Berdiaev and Grasset had like 20 years of correspondence with each other. Very interesting movement. Grasset lived in China, so like this two lived in France, this guy lived in China at the time. But yes, this basically like this very interesting, again, very original movement of Russian thought that kind of went extinct in the second half of the 20th century. But yes, all of these people shared this kind of similar ideas in like recognizing maybe some parts of the they recognize that the revolution, Grasset to lesser extent, but this two for sure, recognize that the revolution happened for reason. That there were like objective issues that allowed the revolution to happen. It wouldn't happen if like everybody was actually happy with the status quo. And also they shared this sentiment that maybe the solution is in some kind of like combining this like new ideas of social justice and equality from socialism, but also like on a medieval and Christian foundation. Well, anyhow, that's the second like flavor of Russian Orthodox thought in the 20th century. And the third flavor of not so much this is very hard to say. Of not so much Russian Orthodox thought, but I guess a mystical form of Christianity was Daniil Andreev. Daniil Andreev represents an entirely different current in Russian religious thought that was not, strictly speaking, I guess, affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church as an institution, but was nonetheless a flavor of Christianity that emerged in the 20th century Russia. So, who was Daniil Andreev? His book is like way in the corner there. It's the first edition of it that was actually published in 1991. So, who was Andreev? Andreev was a writer and poet, and the son of another writer, Leonid Andreev. Andreev, the son of Andreev. Which makes sense. Anyhow, so he was a writer and poet who started to write in the 20s, although almost none of his works were actually published, because most of them were fairly anti-Soviet. So he wrote most of them without the hope of publishing them, and when they were discovered in the 1940s, he actually ended up as a political prisoner, spending a decade between 1947 and 1957 in prison. Before that, in the 1940s, he served in the Red Army, and more successfully than Konstantinov, I guess. At least he was not captured, but he was also a non-combatant, to be fair. He was a combat medic and later a painter for propaganda stuff. So yes, that's how he survived World War II, and again 2 years after that he ended up in a prison because one of his novels critical of the Soviet political regime was discovered and basically became the reason for accusations in anti-Soviet propaganda, even though it was unpublished. It was in the prison that he wrote the drafts of his most well-known work, which is non-fiction. It is a mystical treatise describing his visions, his mystical experiences. That is called The Rose of the World. He started to write the drafts while being in the prison, and he later described how he hid these drafts from prison guards and so on, and completed it after leaving the prison in 1957. Basically, completing this work was the only thing that he managed to do because his health was completely destroyed, and he died a couple of years after being released from the prison. In fact, he was released from the prison in part because of health issues. So the only thing that he managed to do after that was to complete this work, and that's it. Of course, a work like this would not be published in the Soviet Union, so it was only available in samizdat, which were illegal sort of underground publications in the Soviet Union, and later in Immigration, where in New York it was published chapter by chapter by Arkady Rovin, who was a Soviet immigrant and a person deeply interested in mystical and esoteric movements, creating a sort of circle of followers in New York, and a journal called Gnosis, which was precisely the place where chapters of The Rose of the World were originally published for the first time. That's how they became an integral part of this sort of immigrant religious debates. This work is interesting because I feel like it just provides us very nice, very poetic description of Soviet experience. I mean, Andreev was a poet and he was a mystic. He really did not think about them as metaphors. He thought about his experiences as real. And it's very interesting in a way because I have started with a mystical experience of Bukitov, and I will also finish with the mystical experiences of Andreev. He says that he started to have these experiences in 1920s, way before even the war and before his arrest. He was around, he says, 15 years old when he had his first mystical experiences. Here's how he described it. The first event of this kind occurred in August 1921, when I was not yet 15. It happened in Moscow toward the end of the day, as I, then deeply fond of endlessly wandering the streets and aimlessly dreaming, stopped by a parapet in one of the squares surrounding the Church of Christ the Savior, there on the picture, elevated above the riverbank. It was clearly past 7 o'clock and the churches were ringing the evening service. The event I described opened before me, or rather overwhelmed me, with a turbulent, blinding, incomprehensible world, uniting Russia's historical reality with something immeasurably greater standing behind it. And it's interesting that in the next few decades he would have these mystical experiences, most of the positive ones related to Christian environment. It happened in churches, like in this case, when he was hearing, like near a church, when he was hearing the church bells and so on. But also a bunch of negative mystical experiences, which all were associated with the state. First of these, I'll explain it in a moment. So first of these dark experiences happened in 1932. He describes it like this: in February 1932, during a brief stint at a Moscow factory, I fell ill, and in the head of the night gained an experience. Most people would see it only as madness, but to me it was terrifying in content and utterly convincing. The entity involved, which I describe in my books and now refer to as the third Witzraor, Witzraor is not translatable. It's his own original word. It's not a word I invented. It entered my consciousness at that moment. Simplifying its meaning, this colossal being, similar to deep-sea monsters but vastly larger, can be described as a demon of a state chauvinism. So, based on this series of mystical visions, Andreev basically developed this philosophy of history in which there are two powers fighting between each other throughout the whole history. One of them is this kind of spiritual power that elevates humanity and encourages it to move forward toward progress and making itself better. But then another power associated with the state, or the state chauvinism, as he says here. In Russian, it's actually a very peculiar phrase. He calls them демоны великодержавной государственности. So that's what I'm translating, a demon of state chauvinism. So it's basically toxic patriotism, or jingoism maybe is another possible way to translate it. So he basically equates Satan with this state for the sake of the state kind of thinking. And he depicts the entire history as the fight between these two powers. And whatever prevails will, of course, probably in part at least depends on which of them we will serve to and which of them we will empower with our own actions. But I think it's a very poetic and beautiful reflection of this 20th century Russian mentality. And Andreev himself basically concludes that his work is a reflection of his own experience. He says about himself at the very beginning of The Rose of the World, I belong to those mortally wounded by the two great catastrophes, world wars and tyranny. For us, both of these catastrophes were apocalypses of sorts, revelations about the power of the universal evil and its perennial war with the forces of light. Nothing would change my opinion that the biggest threats that humanity faces now and will face in the centuries to come are a great suicidal war and an absolute worldwide tyranny. And I think, if not particularly optimistic, it's nonetheless a good place to finish my talk for today. I think it's a perfect reflection and a perfect summary of experiences of all four of our figures today. Not only Andreev, but I think that all four of them were people mortally wounded by these two great catastrophes. Wounded in different ways and struggling to find a solution, struggling to find an alternative, struggling to find a way out. The ways out that they proposed were vastly different, ranging from kind of a conservative program that we see in Bukitov and Konstantinov to the sort of let's combine Middle Ages with socialism and liberalism, to this completely different and mystical and anarchist form of thought represented by Andreev. But all of them, nonetheless, developed from the shared experience and tried to solve the same issues.